You there? Oh. Yeah.
This is the Tech and Eugene again. I should be sending you the dual video now, so I'm just doing a final check-in right before they start.
Yeah, we have the PowerPoint and the presenter.
Okay, so everything's working well for you?
Yeah, we're trying to get the PowerPoint on a projector up here, but that's my issue. So.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. All right, well, I'm going to head up to the booth at this point, and they'll probably get underway. So.
All right.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Um, Portland is here with us being simulcast. This is one of our, I believe, maybe our first simulcast lecture to the White Stag building in Portland. Can everybody in Portland hear me? I'm not getting any response from Portland. They're pointing at us.
Yep.
Oh, you can hear me? Great. All right,
Yeah.
thanks very much. All right, so welcome to this year's Davis Lecture. The Davis Lecture Series is made possible by a generous endowment from the Davis family, and the art department is very pleased to have been able to use this endowment to host tonight's speaker, Jan Tumlir. Jan Tumlir is a Los Angeles-based art writer and curator. His writings appear regularly in Art Forum, Frieze, and Flash Art. In addition, he has written catalog essays for such artists such as Bastian Otter, Uda Barth, Jorge Pardo, and Pei White. He's also recently written a monograph on Los Angeles artist Charlie White. Jan is a well-known and highly regarded figure in many artistic and academic circles, and I was very fortunate as a graduate student to have studied with Jan while at the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, where Jan was and still is teaching art history and critical theory. Jan is also at UCLA, where he is currently teaching a year-long class on modernism. Jan is also one of the authors of LA Artland, a book on contemporary art in Los Angeles, which was published by the Black Dog Press in 2005. His latest curatorial effort, among many, the show Desert Shore, was mounted at the Luckman Gallery at Cal State Los Angeles. Second Cannons Press has published a book by Jan, also titled Desert Shore, in conjunction with that show. More recently, Jan has provided a written piece titled Crossing Paths for the group show of Walking in Ice, which was curated by our own Jack Ryan, head of head of foundations. The preview opening for this show is tomorrow night at the White Cube Gallery at our White Stag building in Portland. Both Jack Ryan and Jan Tumler will be giving a short talk at that opening tomorrow night. So I encourage you to attend. So the University of Oregon is honored not only to have Jan here as our Davis lecturer, but also as a participant in the Walking on Ice show. And the full text of the written piece is available. We have only 13 copies left here in Eugene, Oregon, but they're available for free. I'll put them on the table there. And it's, again, the full text of the Crossing Paths writing. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jan Tumler tonight.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for having me here. Thanks to Donald and Jack Ryan especially for bringing me out here. I think it all started with this text that Donald just mentioned, a sort of catalog essay piece, which is more, in a way, a piece of creative writing. And thanks also to Heidi Howes, Beth Roy for sort of helping me around, getting around campus. Had some great meetings. Jesse Sugarman, Courtney Kemp, Lyle, all interesting stuff. Great work going on here. Super friendly people. So I've enjoyed my stay so far. What I wanted to talk about today, and I was kind of vacillating because I have, kind of set lectures that I've done in various different contexts, and I have one or two that are sort of ready to go. But I was really excited to actually sort of share some of the material that I'm working on for what I would call an essay book, a long essay. There's a whole tradition of these, of course, and I cite them in this book, a kind of illustrious tradition of such as, for instance, Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. There's many others of that sort. That was largely my kind of point of departure for this book. And I was interested in this concept of the first book, of a writer's first book, and what should the first book consist of. I try to go back up here. And it's something I've actually been mulling over for a long time, having started and sort of left off a number of books, kind of thinking that would be a better second book or a third book. You have to establish something before you kind of put those out. So the book I've decided to write is actually, I would call it a book of aesthetic philosophy. It's kind of a philosophy book, and I don't really have a background in philosophy. My background is in art criticism. It's really in contemporary art. Donald mentioned that I've been teaching this class at UCLA, a class on modernism, which requires all kinds of booking up on my end to get all the things right, because again, it's not my expertise. So neither is philosophy. However, obviously contemporary art, art history, and aesthetic philosophy intersect at many points. And I think one reason I kind of came around to thinking this was the right book to get into was writing this little piece for Walking on Ice. And I don't know how many of you have read it. Maybe, has anyone read it? Has anyone seen it? Okay, those of you that read it, it's obviously like an extremely condensed piece of writing. And I'm aware of that as a kind of style. It's a kind of what used to be called the feuilleton style, almost like a journalistic style in German newspapers, where essayists like Walter Benjamin, Siegfried Krakauer, all these people, Karl Kraus, people that wrote for daily newspapers, kind of inserted deep sort of philosophical thought into that context, but in this super condensed way, because it was, after all, a newspaper. It was written for a general public. It had to be sort of exciting. So I have a sense, like in this piece, that the concepts are really buried. It's so condensed that the concepts, the underlying concepts, are buried within it. The essay book that I'm working on is an attempt to sort of extrapolate from those, to kind of pull them out a little bit, but while maintaining some of that condensation. I can't describe it any other way. I think, ultimately I'm kind of seeing that as sort of my style, is this condensed style. And it's a way to kind of bring back ideas that exist. And I guess you could say all ideas exist, right? There's no such a thing as a good idea, because they're all already out there. They're good, they're bad, they're in the air. There's kind of what you do with them. So there's no new ideas, per se, in this essay. But I think that there perhaps is a kind of new, well, somewhat new or novel way to put them together, to sort of condense them into some kind of new sort of proposition. At any rate, I decided for the poster, these two figures, Asterix and Obelix. Obelix, of course, with the O in the name, is the fatter one. Asterix is the little one. They are Gauls who, in a French comic book, spend each episode of their adventures assaulting the Roman Empire. They're barbarians. And I'm going to come back to the theme of the barbarian because it's kind of a key part of what I'm writing about. The relationship of barbarism to art, and both the good versions and the bad versions of barbarism. For me, reading these comic books at an early age, this was a great version of barbarism. I wanted to be part of this club, basically. Going out with these folks, because they were sort of pranksters in a way. They were barbarians because they're a marauding tribe. They're not part of a civilized society. And yet, they are creating a society of their own, right? And all day today I was looking for this beautiful last frame that is in every episode, every book of Asterix and Obelix. At the end of the day, they have their huge adventure, and then they all kind of gather together in the forest. It's always a nighttime scene to roast a pig. And that last shot, was like so attractive. It was like this kind of thing that you wanted to be absorbed into. At any rate, that to me was a community, a real community that you could sort of oppose to, but the by then decadent empire that was Rome. So yes, barbarians, but also barbarians who are kind of working on new models of sociability, new concepts of being, a new social order that is actually more just, equitable, etc. Then the names, which I'm going to take as the title of this book. But I've reversed them back to their proper names, Asterisk and Obelisk. Now I think it's totally clever on this cartoonist part to kind of misspell the names, right? Because they're barbarians, so they kind of get things wrong with regard to the proper way of doing things. And yet, the terms, I think, are so suggestive. Let me just go down here for a sec. Here's an asterisk. And of course, here's really the epitome of the obelisk at the Place de la Concorde. Georges Bataille wrote many pieces about this because he cited it as the emblem of the martial spirit. For him, the obelisk was the ultimate monument to the martial spirit. It is a work of art, and yet it is an extremely aggressive work of art. So I started thinking that maybe there's these two kinds of art practices, and they're embedded in the names of these two characters. You know, on the one hand, you've got the obelisk, which is a very aggressive, what I might call a aggressive claiming of space. It's a place marker, a sign of occupation. It is the martial monument par excellence. The asterisk is a place keeper in the sense that it's reserving a space. It's not claiming the space, unless we want to talk about claiming space in that sociological sense, right? If people heard that term, it's kind of the study of subcultures, claiming space. It's, for instance, what subculture, youth cultures do on the street. They claim the street, even though the street doesn't belong to them. So they hang out on the corner. Maybe they tag the corner, perhaps. They do something to that space that is, in a way, impermanent, fleeting, but marks their occupation, perhaps in a much more subtle way than the obelisk. So I'm thinking of the asterisk as something that also claims a space, but it claims a space next to an existing space, right? When you encounter an asterisk in a text, you'll encounter it next to a word and perhaps a sentence. And it's suggesting that there's more to come somewhere else in regard to this, right? That the meaning that you're reading here is not complete in itself. You have to follow that little sign somewhere else to get its meaning. That to me seems really significant. And again, I'm thinking of these as two models of art practice. Very often, and the work that really interests me does both. In a way, it puts an asterisk next to an obelisk. So the obelisk is the sign of being there now. The asterisk is the sign of something still to come. Two very different ways of working. One, perhaps on the side of war, and I'm going to, again, take this as a monument that continually reappears within, in relationship to the war machine, right from, its inception, its positioning here in the Place de la Concorde, to the obelisk that was raised in the Nevada test sites, right, where they had the first atom bomb tests. This structure keeps reappearing in these types of contexts. In a way, you could say hopeless contexts. And yet I think the asterisk position next to them, on top of them, beside them, gives that context a somewhat positive potential, like a positive spin. Now, of course, there's a total sexual symbology when you bring the two of them together, the asterisk and the obelisk. And in fact, there's a weird kind of homoerotics being played out by these two characters, oftentimes in the comic books. So that's obviously a part of it, too. All good work obviously has some kind of sexual tension built into it, right? We don't have to describe it in precisely those terms, but there is this kind of dynamic. Concealing, revealing, penetrating, withdrawing. These are, in a way, the sort of fundamental sort of dynamics of any composition. Okay, are people following me? Okay, so I want to come back to that. I'm actually going to hopefully not take too much time with this, although I prepared a super long, ridiculously overwrought lecture where, again, I'm trying to extrapolate the terms of that essay that I wrote in Walking on Ice, trying to kind of label the points that I'm touching on. The asterisk and the obelisk are both signs of claiming space. I came to that kind of thinking about art in relationship to space, and by that I mean typically space as it exists not merely in the gallery, but outside the gallery, and really thinking more perhaps about public monuments and these types of things, artists' relationship to the topography, artists' relationships to particular sites. The show, Walking on Ice, departs from a book written by Werner Herzog, which documents a trip that he took on foot, I think between Munich and Paris, at least between two European capitals. And it sort of sets up this condition of an artwork made in transit, an artwork made outside of the context of one's usual mode of operation. So that was what really got me thinking about artists outside. Artists outside their context, artists outside the institution, artists in relationship to certain kinds of sites. And then finally, what is it that draws artists to certain sites, to particular sites? Why do artists return, for instance, to certain sites? Why do monuments take place? Why are monuments built here and not there, right? What is the relationship of all of these decisions that are made? So I begin with a discussion which is essentially taken from Freud, and it's taken from his book Totem and Taboo, discussing the site in which a culture first comes together. Now, Freud presents this idea first in 1912. He resumes it in 1938. That is to say, he first comes to it on the eve of the First World War. He comes back to it on the eve of the Second World War. Both times he's thinking about what are the origins of the culture. The question as to what cultural origins might be, the reconsideration of culture from the ground up, is obviously precipitated by a perception of crisis, right? A looming crisis. Again, it's a feeling that I have about a lot of the work in the show, Walking on Ice. It's a feeling I certainly have about a lot of work that's out there right now, is that this notion of art somehow responding to crisis is made very evident in a lot of this work. What I want to talk about here is that perhaps art is always responding to crisis. And again, I'm using Freud's sort of analysis of society at its most fundamental level to kind of set up that argument. So between the ramp up, the execution, intermission, re-execution, and aftermath of the period of great wars, World War I, World War II, an at first aberrant idea is gradually rendered commonplace, that group murder is the foundational event of civilization. That is his thesis in Totem and Taboo. Essentially, he says religion comes out of group murder. Now, again, that idea seems horrific, monstrous. Even today, when we know it well, it still strikes a chord of disbelief, etc. And yet, the thing that I think is interesting is that someone would sort of begin thinking this way at a particular time, under particular conditions, that he would start to look at the culture, what the culture forms around, in a way, sort of dispense with all the existing institutions, the things that normalize the culture, and start thinking about it, so to speak, outside of the box. He advances this idea, as I said, in Totem and Taboo, 1912. By way of precedent, he cites Charles Darwin, who supplies the hypothesis that men originally lived in small hordes, each under the rule of an older male who governed by force. This is the basis of the terrifying father figure that Freud calls the imago. He also cites J.J. Atkinson, who provides, quote, the suggestion that this patriarchal system came to an end through a rebellion of the sons who united against the father, overpowered him, and together consumed his body. Finally, he cites Robertson Smith, who provides the totem theory. Freud's here's another sort of more exciting cover for Totem and Taboo. I'm just going to read a little bit of this because it's a sort of a complicated strand of thoughts, I think. Weaving together all of these ideas, Freud emerges with a structural account of the origins of religious life. That is to say, all religion. The murdered father becomes a spirit, a god. The consumption of his body becomes ritual. The totems that are erected in his place become the, quote, mythic symbols, the scripture and iconography of the religious cult that forms in his absence. The father must be killed and then eaten so that nothing remains of him. It is his literal erasure from the face of the earth that authorizes the succession of imaginary transpositions that follow. The body of the father is the original lost object, for those of you that have read Freud. And then Lacan, who puts the lost object into purely linguistic terms. It is in this void of forcefully deposed force, the father figure, this first father, is a terrible, violent creature, right? Who has his way with all the women in the tribe, and these include his daughters, etc. So this forceful deposition of force that gets rid of the father creates the first link in this signifying chain that underwrites not only religion, but, as I want to show, culture as such. Now I'm saying here, again, not an original thought, but we can extrapolate from what Freud is saying, that culture comes out of religion, right? Culture or religion is the first site of art, the cathedral. The church is the first repository of the mythic symbols that will then be transferred into the art gallery and the art museum when we undergo the process of modernization and we go from a sacral to a secular society. In 1937, on the brink of a second round of total war, Freud resumes the central tenets of Totem and Taboo in two essays written for the journal Imago. These are later collected as parts 1 and 2 of the book Moses and Monotheism, which is published in London in 1938. Part 3 of this book opens with an introduction that is itself divided into two sections. Prefatory notes. The first one written before March 1938 in Vienna, and then prefatory notes, June 1938, London. In between these two writings is the period of Freud's exodus. The Anschluss is imminent. At this point, Freud is conscious of the sensitive nature of his argument. Quote, if our research leads us to a result that reduces religion to the status of a neurosis of mankind and explains its grandiose powers in the same way as we should a neurotic obsession in our individual patients, then we may be sure we shall incur in this country the greatest resentment of the powers that be. He goes on to say, we are living here in a Catholic country under the protection of that church, uncertain how long the protection will last. He delays the writing of his book until he is out of harm's way. It is not cowardice, he writes, but caution. A new enemy, quote unquote, has appeared on the horizon that is much more dangerous than the old one. So again, 1938, he's left Vienna, already sort of taken over by the Germans, and he's in London. Here's a shot of Freud's office, obviously the couch, in London. I think it's significant, as I was mentioning, that Freud writes two of his most sweepingly speculative, because this is only speculation, right? There's no way to prove any of this. In fact, when Freud comes down to proof, all he can talk about is some findings within social anthropology, which certainly do qualify as a kind of proof if you see indigenous people as former figures of ourselves pushed back in time. But much more to the point, and I think this testifies to his ethic, he uses fairy tales and storybooks and legends and myths. These, for Freud, are the documents of our prehistory. Fairy tales are the documents of the prehistory of our civilization. That, I think, is a pretty brilliant idea on his part. So, again, significant that he writes these speculative works during troubled times. Both Totem and Taboo and then Moses and Monotheism are published really on the eve of destruction. He writes in the first set of notes to Moses and Monotheism, quote, "We live in very remarkable times." I'll give you some little background pictures here. That, of course, is Lenin, painted in the socialist realist style, which by 1935 was the mandated style of the Soviet state. A lot of Jewish German intellectuals had been looking to the Soviet Union for some kind of guidance in terms of what the world could be, should be, for a kind of utopian opening. By 1935, the revolution had turned counter-revolutionary, and in a certain way, the art is indicative of this. He says, "We live in very remarkable times. We find with astonishment that progress has concluded an alliance with barbarism." This theme that progress leads to barbarism, that barbarism is not the breakdown in progress, but that progress leads directly to barbarism, that too will become a kind of commonplace of post-war thought. And again, I sort of encounter it with surprise. Like, to me, that's a surprising thought. And yet, to my father, for instance, it was not a surprising thought, because it was very much part of the sort of intellectual fashion of that time. It's not a wrong turn. It's not a dead end. Progress industrialism, in fact, the Enlightenment leads directly into barbarism. Now, here again, we have to ask, what is barbarism? I sort of began by talking about a more positive model of what barbarism is. When Walter Benjamin writes about barbarism, he's also thinking about something, at the very least, dialectically. But the simple definition is barbarism is the state of being without tradition. Barbarians have no tradition. And which is something I want to come back to, because in a certain way, artists have no tradition. At the very least, modern artists or contemporary artists are supposed not to, right? If you are a real artist, in some way you have to go against the tradition. You cannot simply be the recipient of something that's passed down to you. However, he, of course, is making the case with a certain degree of horror. Freud mentions in this regard, i.e. barbarism, the counter-revolutionary turn in Soviet Russia, where the attempt, quote, the attempt has been made to better the life of 100 million people till now held in suppression, but in doing so, they subjected them to the most cruel coercion and robbed them of every possible freedom of thought. That's Soviet Russia. In Italy, a similar brutality is on the rise, and it is tied to a similarly altruistic social program. But the alliance with barbarism reaches its peak in his own country. Freud sounds an uncharacteristic note of bitter irony on this point. Quote, "It was a real weight off the heart to find, in the case of the German people, that retrogression into all but prehistoric barbarism can come to pass independently of any progressive idea." So that's irony, obviously. Here I'm going to show you a slide. Right around the same time, this of course is a sculpture by Arno Breker titled Readiness, 1938. This is from the Paris Exposition of right around that same time, when in fact the Soviets and the Germans faced off across the architecture of the Tour Eiffel. On one side, you have Albert Speer's monument. On the other side, you have this one, this Soviet piece of propaganda. Which is a completely straightforward rhetorical explanation for the motif of the hammer and sickle, right? You have a farm girl and an industrial laborer, the farm girl raising the sickle, the industrial worker the hammer. They come together. The former sort of agrarian class becomes the industrial class. At any rate, they're facing off at this point. Two fascist powers facing off over a number of issues. They're actually mirroring each other in a certain way because they espouse the same ideology, but they're also facing off over Spain and the Spanish Civil War and their very different stakes in it. So at any rate, let me just give you this great picture. This is a drawing by Adolf Hitler of a German shepherd. Shows that he did have a stake in art, after all, which everyone knows, actually. The core principle of Freud's theory are already well established by the time Moses and Monotheism is published in 1938. It is the intellectual climate that has changed. The vaunted freedom of thought has once again become a rare privilege to exercise with utmost caution, and therefore not really a freedom at all. In their Gothic nostalgia for a pre-modern community, the Nazis will be seen as the harbingers of a new dark age, and Freud will have to wait until he is in London to finish his book. The precipitating cause of that book is the coming disaster. The effect is a complete reassessment of the social structure from the ground up. Peace is hard won, apparently, and not just through violence, but through a violence of the most heinous sort, group murder. Accordingly, as Freud narrates it, the rule of law emerges from the ultimate crime, parricide or patricide, followed by cannibalism. Religion is proposed as the first law, the first social order, the first institution. It takes shape on the consecrated ground around what will be from here on in an eternally absent host. The congregation gathers to summon his spirit, the Holy Spirit, via rituals that allow everyone to simultaneously remember and forget their stake in its production. All right. Now, here's the bust of G.W.F. Hegel by Ludwig W. Wickman. I'm bringing this up because this is a lecture on aesthetics, not psychoanalysis, not religion, not politics, not social theory. It's a lecture on aesthetics, which Hegel defines as the science of sensation or feeling, i.e. aesthetics, interestingly, is one's response to art. It is the analysis of the sensation, the feeling that art provokes. How do we transition from this theory of society that I've been developing here with Freud, this theory of morality, of ethics and law, to a theory of art? The answer is found in the writings of the German Romantics, poet-philosophers such as Schiller, Schlegel, Novalis, and Hölderlin, all of whom can also be described as early Hegelians. Here, art is understood as the contemporary manifestation of the same spirit, what the Germans called Geist, as in Zeitgeist, spirit of the age. This is the same spirit that is channeled through religion, but now it has been grounded via the Romantics on a secular plane. According to Hegel, art is one among a number of forms, what he calls forms. These include religion, art, science, philosophy. All of these forms, according to Hegel, house the same concept, and that concept is the spirit, or Geist again. But they house that spirit in different ways. All are essentially means of truth-telling, hence means of accessing the absolute. Hegel, and I think you can say this for all the German Romantics, are very overtly departing from a religious base in their discussion of aesthetics. Aesthetics takes the mother lode of mythic symbols out of the church and then reinterprets them as values, as aesthetic values, as things that have a particular kind of impact on the beholder. We're no longer meant to simply read these things, but to sense them, to feel them. Art is itself divided into 5 discrete forms: architecture, sculpture, painting, music, poetry. Together, these comprise the pantheon, as Hegel puts it, a term that indicates to the sacred root of his aesthetic theory. Everything in art develops out of religious thought, and that first moment that man draws himself, by way of reflection, up and out of the immediate sensuous reality that surrounds him. Before this, man lived in nature like water in water, as Bataille puts it. The spirit is therefore the concept, in that its presence cannot be empirically verified, yet it is inwardly known to be there. Art gives objective form to this subjective concept. Architecture, Hegel argues, provides the temple of the God. Sculpture provides the God who is to dwell in the temple. And the modern arts of painting, music, and poetry portray the community that worships the God. The phenomenology of the spirit outlines the evolution of the spirit concept as it passes through three general stages in the evolution of art: symbolic, classical, romantic. Accordingly, we travel from the East, and Hegel has great things to say about these pyramids. They are the beginning of art. We travel from the East, land of the Egyptian pyramids, to the West of classical Greece, and then finally to Germany. And here's, of course, Caspar David Friedrich, Die Winterreise, the winter trip, where the Romantic movement is in full bloom. Within Hegel's account, this last stage, this is modernism, at which point art as such comes to an end. And he is really kind of drawn to the deathly quality of romantic art, especially pictorial, in its pictorial forms. There is this emphasis on the dead thing, on deathly colors, on static forms, on mineral forms. This trajectory is circular, or better, triangular, because we begin with the pyramids. It begins with geometric, rectilinear abstraction, right? The art of the Egyptians is geometric, abstract, non-figurative, non-natural, non-organic, and then gradually develops towards organic, curvilinear representation. He sees it as the spirit touching down, right? And if we look at a pyramid, it is literally a kind of graph, one could say, right? It's an arrow pointing upwards. It hugs the earth at its base and then disappears into thin air. It channels these two parts of the landscape, right? At the horizon line, it channels the space between earth and sky. And again, we can say between materiality and the ether. If we consider art this total movement, as he does, as a trajectory, it has channeled the eye of God down in a frozen perspectival stream onto the earth. There, spirit suddenly takes shape in living forms. Hegel still sees classical art as religious art. It is not completely given to, reveling in the sensuality, the pure kind of prosaic nature. It is nature sort of inspired by the breath of God. However, when we get to this point, we come full circle. The art of the Egyptians is the very epitome of an art of death, right? Everything is constructed around frozen forms, immovable forms, mineral forms. These things are essentially a kind of necropolis right? These pyramids, they're homes of the dead, and we return to the necropolis, the city of the dead, in the work of Friedrich. And in a certain way, the actual crumbling of this structure, the dying away of the pictorial form in this work, for Hegel, sort of suggests the liberation of the spirit finally to roam the earth in its pure form, which is to say, as a concept. Under Romanticism, the artist penetrates the outward forms of nature, appearance, in pursuit of their inner rule, essence. Form and concept are thereby fused into the totality of the idea, which returns us to abstraction. But now the abstraction is no longer a pictorial abstraction. It is rather a kind of concept. I'm just bringing up this famous graph by Alfred H. Barr, his diagram from 1936 that he provided for the Museum of Modern Art, where he charts the entire development of modern art from all of its separate practices into these two buckets at the bottom. And these are non-geometrical abstract art, geometrical abstract art. Okay, I'm going to move on here a little bit. Okay, this is Heidegger's hut in the forest. This is where Heidegger was exiled when he actually made a pact with fascism. This is the point where German philosophy kind of dead ends in a certain way. But Heidegger has the exact same account as Hegel of art's movement. He uses the example of the temple as the original work of art. For him, the first work is the temple work. And here's how he puts it. This is from The Origin of the Work of Art. Quote, "The temple work, standing there, opens up a world and at the same time sets this world back again on earth, which itself only thus emerges as native ground." Native ground, consecrated ground, the kind of relationship of something being set up in order to be what it is what Heidegger is always on about. Through the example of the temple work, these are a series of Greek temples that I'll show you. Sanctuary of Poseidon at Caloria. This is interior of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. Through the example of the temple work, Heidegger goes on to describe the art-making process as consecration. The temple is a structure built for a god, and it serves to hold the place of this god on earth because it, quote, portrays nothing and, quote, simply stands there. This, quote, building encloses the figure of the god, and in this concealment lets it stand out into the holy precinct through the open portico. By means of the temple, the god is present in the temple. It is a work that lets the god himself be present and thus is the god himself. he's talking about these types of works. And again, from our perspective, yes, they're part of antiquity, but we can trace all kinds of like current, analogies to this type of work. Mike Kelly, for instance, is working within this mode. Perhaps further back, we could talk about Marcel Duchamp's famous piece, Étant donné. Étant donné is a kind of temple work, right? It is a temple or a housing, in a way, built around a statue. That statue is only partly visible from the outside of this thing. It is a house that is not made for human beings, right? It's made for a statue which, in a way, channels some other absolute spirit or presence. Of course, Duchamp has completely secularized that formulation, and yet the formulation itself is significant, I think, and it's something that, again, we can think about in a contemporary context. It seems to make sense. Now, here again, I'm curious, why Heidegger, at roughly the same time, again, draws the sort of fundamental original artwork back to this sacred root. Why he would choose to put it outside in this way, to make it a kind of marker on earth of something else. This type of thing, in a certain way, could be thought of as both an obelisk and an asterisk, right? Because the god is in the temple, but the god is not the statue. These are both the temple and the statue placeholders. Heidegger's essay continues with this process of secularizing the motif. He moves from the temple work to Van Gogh's paintings of peasant boots. Here we're no longer asked to indulge in religious speculation. The boots are not mythic symbols, nor do they contain anything of the otherworldly. Worn, creased, and dirty, those boots are made of much the same base material stuff that Van Gogh's painting is made of. And yet somehow still they are being aesthetically set up. The painted boots make more evident what the temple work tends to dissemble through its lofty construction, i.e., that in works, the world grounds itself in the earth, and the earth juts through the world. The world, in resting upon the earth, strives to surmount it. As self-opening, it cannot endure anything closed. The earth, however, as sheltering and concealing, tends to draw the world into itself and keep it there. This play of opening and closing, revealing and concealing, is key to Heidegger's conception of how art, on the most basic level, works. And here again, these operations are evenly divided between the poles of world and earth. Worlds open up what earth closes down. But what exactly is it that is first concealed and then revealed? Passing from the temple work to the boot painting, Heidegger suggests that it is truth, and moreover, quote, the essence of the true. In this way, art is succeeded by philosophy, which can ostensibly dispense with the sensuous material world of forms altogether. This is a movement of dematerialization, and it is especially evident in the writings of idea artists like Joseph Kosuth, who are already considering art in terms of its survival, i.e., art after philosophy. Kosuth answers to Hegel, as do Clement Greenberg and Michael Fried. All of American critical theory, all of American modernist and postmodern art writing answers to a German romantic root. It carries over these formulations, which again are fundamentally religious formulations, formulations built around this sort of concern for the mythic symbols and the tradition that carries them forwards, except when we get to the US, that tradition is basically cut short, and yet little figures of it reappear. In this regard, it's worth noting that Freud starts his essay on art and objecthood with a quote about the Puritans, which straightaway steeps his aesthetic theory in the language of redemption. This opening line is surprising, but not so surprising, as everyone knows that art's origins are sacred. Less familiar, perhaps even suppressed, are the attempts to think past this formulation. If art comes out of religion, then what does religion come out of? What is the meaning behind the meaning of the mythic symbols? One last quote here. This is Richard Wagner, his essay on religion and art. He begins it with the assertion, one could say that wherever religion has become artistic, it is left to art to save the core of religion, in that it grasps the mythic symbols, which religion wants to believe are true in a real sense, in terms of their symbolic values, so that the profound truth hidden in them can be recognized through their ideal representation. Did people get that, or should I read it again? Okay. Because it's quite a good quote, actually. One could say that wherever religion has become artistic, i.e., that whole process we've been sort of outlining, secularization of these churchly forms, it is left to art to save the core of religion, in that it grasps the mythic symbols which religion wants to believe are true in a real sense in terms of their symbolic values, so that the profound truth hidden in them can be recognized through their ideal representations. To save is to redeem, but now I'd say in the context of crisis, right? Redemption can happen to anyone, anytime. To save something, one must be saved from a danger, a disaster, a crisis. As mentioned, post-war US art criticism stems from a common German Romantic root, as this is effectively where, quote, the concept of criticism, as Walter Benjamin's article is titled, emerges. In the modern era, criticism becomes central to the production of art and to its reception as well. It is the point at which these otherwise distinct processes intersect. Criticism is at the crux of Friedrich Schiller's program on the aesthetic education of man, where aesthetics is not conceived as just one particular category of a general curriculum, but its overall foundation. Likewise, the poet-philosopher Novalis, who says, quote, we are on a mission. We have been called upon for the education, Bildung, of the earth. Overall, the German Romantic program is progressive, closely aligned with that of the Enlightenment. The education of the earth will be accomplished by way of critique. But I want to recall the tone of urgency in Wagner's statement, where education is also a matter of saving. Crisis is implicit in critique, in the etymology of the term. The etymology of crisis, in turn, is medical and refers to a failing or dysfunction of the organism. That is the etymology of crisis, which then works into critique. To criticize is therefore to diagnose, to point out the disease by tracing the physical symptom to its cause, and in this way initiate a treatment and a cure. In art, we can say that the diagnosis and the cure are simultaneous. To diagnose is to cure. Here's Friedrich Hölderlin from the poem Patmos. Quote, but where the danger is, grows the saving power also. As a central component of its production and reception, art is always, to a greater or lesser degree, a response to crisis. In the US context of the post-war years, this crisis is one of art. In the pre-war context of early Romanticism, however, this crisis is social. Art is an effect of crisis as opposed to its cause. Now that's where, okay, I've sort of running out of time here a little bit. I just wanted to insert one final thought into this. And this has to do with the return to the figure that I outlined in the beginning, the figure of the parricide, who I now want to link back to the figure of the artist. Why would art be in crisis at this point? Obviously, concentration camps, death camps, the degenerate art show, no worse than the official German art show. There is seen in all of this, again, a confluence between avant-gardism and fascism. Right from the military etymology of the avant-garde, right from its sort of violent posturing, which can be, again, taken whole cloth and completely twisted to suit the aims of the opposition. The unholy alliance, then, especially evident between Marinetti and Mussolini. The aestheticization of politics, as Walter Benjamin puts it, which always makes for fascism. The principle of autonomy, which has pulled art out of the public sphere, which has made it an elite occupation. All of these are now parts of the crisis of art. This then is the basis of the contemporary animosity that society directs toward advanced art. The extent of the rift between art and society is unprecedented. But if we follow the steps of our historical trajectory backward, we find that the artist is always an ambivalent figure at least, inasmuch as she or he represents the public and even produces the public as a public, but does so in a way that the public innately rejects. The artist is a social pariah, initially disowned by society. She or he eventually returns to it in a time of crisis. The artist now assumes the guise of a hero. Brought back to society in order to fix it, the artist manages only to express its brokenness. This is the diagnosis, which is distressing to most who go on to reject it, and thereby also to reject the artist once more. But what the public does not understand is that the diagnosis is also the treatment. The cure comes later, once everyone has already forgotten about the artist. But the cure is a direct outcome of her or his actions. All right, I'm getting there. We're approaching the end here shortly. All right. Okay. Now to loop it up back again to, I'm having problems with the slides here. To loop it back, right, are these, are this, Outlet not working here? Down? All right. To loop it back to this original discussion in Totem and Taboo, if we've already made the connection between religion and art, then perhaps we can say that the artist is the original parricide. The artist is the original father killer. The signature theory of Freudian psychoanalysis is, of course, drawn from classical culture. It's drawn from art. The Oedipus plays of Aeschylus. Here, Freud locates a work of art that segues swiftly between the imaginary and the real via the symbolic. It is comprised in equal parts of legend and history, as is all myth. Through the particular narrative of this individual figure, i.e., his ontogenetic narrative, we derive a collective narrative of humanity, a phylogenetic narrative. Once again, it concerns the emergence of law from out of a context of crime. This, though, is a crime against country, a crime against humanity, and a crime against nature. I'm using the three designations that were directed against the Nazis in the trial period. The crime has to be sufficiently heinous, that is to say, traumatic, to become embedded in the individual and collective psyche. And it has to also be sufficiently traumatic to warrant its repression. That is to say, this thing has to be both remembered and forgotten. Sorry. I'm going to show you two violent images from the history of art. Goya, Saturn devouring his son. You can say perhaps the son here gains retribution. An image that Bataille put into every illustrated book that he ever wrote in of Aztec sacrifices, which again he saw as a community forming event. It is here, again I'm talking about Oedipus, in the play between commemoration and repression, or, as Heidegger puts it, concealing and revealing, that a narrative that might otherwise remain put on the side of the social, that is having to do with power and politics, assumes an aesthetic relevance. Oedipus is a tragic hero because he is not conscious of his identity, and hence the gravity of his crimes, that is to say, parricide and incest. His self-consciousness is gained precisely as a consequence of his trespasses. This process is significant for art, which is the most direct record we have of the experience of the subject. Again, Freud would see this, along with fairy tales, myths, children's stories, and whatnot, as a document of the prehistory of our subjectivity. As a precondition for this sort of narrative, the Oedipus narrative, the hero must first be disassociated from their familial context so that they can return to it years later as a stranger. In Freud's band of brothers, the primal horde, it is not the youngest son that murders, as he can simply await the process of natural succession, but rather the oldest, the firstborn, The firstborn is an apt model for the artist, as he is the most likely to be spurned by the father as a rival and sent packing. It is only later that he returns in the guise of another, having perhaps repressed the trauma of his rejection. Art, aesthetics, is what occurs in the period between the crisis, the trauma, and its resolution, the cure. That is to say, art requires a crisis in order to come into being. Critique is the process of diagnosis and treatment in one. It is carried out in the intermediate period of not knowing and knowing, which is not to confine it to a conveniently vague in-between, because I want to articulate it in more positive terms. It is rather a kind of interregnum, which marks the period of transition between one order of knowledge, and we can even say one social order, and another. The crisis that art answers to is always a crisis in order, a breakdown in the lines of intergenerational succession. Simply put, a breakdown in the communication of tradition. At such times, and Mars is their rising sign, the cultural slate is wiped clean, or almost. One upshot of this is quite literally barbarism, as this is the condition of having been entirely disassociated from any existing tradition. The artist is also always a barbarian in this sense, but the artist is also concerned to restore order, to restore the world to a more just and equitable order by repairing the lines of communication. Art is communication, but it is not the communication of a message when the message has itself been forgotten. Rather, it is the attempt to recover what was formerly there, while at the same time recovering all the distortions it has undergone over time. Latency, this is a Freudian term, latency, and I want to put all aesthetic developments into that category. Latency is the in-between period between forgetting and remembering, not knowing and knowing, or knowing, not knowing, and knowing. Latency is that period where thoughts are allowed to sort of start acquiring new, different contours, right? Because we don't exactly know what they consist of. They're not ideas. They're not concepts. They're vague kind of inclinations that one might have, a vague attraction or drive to do something, right? That's essentially what produces a practice, is a vague but powerful inclination that is only verbalized at the end of the day, right? Because what keeps it going is precisely the sense that one does not know exactly what the answer will be. Latency, though, is a condition that only arises if the cause, if the precipitating cause of the interest was powerful enough. I was using the language heinous, but perhaps we could say traumatic enough to warrant this kind of mulling over, this kind of working out in psychoanalytic terms. Freud apologizes for the two-part structure of his book. I'm going back to Moses and monotheism, as it entails some repetition. But in the guise of a failing, he is also demonstrating the operations of the psyche, which must forever return and repeat thoughts in time in order to at last understand their deeper import. Not what they mean so much as why they are there, why these have remained put while others have been let go. In the reiteration, it is not the thought that is understood, but one's relationship to the thought, within which is within which is disclosed the riddle of identity. So, done. Any questions? I know that I kind of threw out a lot of stuff there.
A few questions. So there will probably be questions may also be coming from Portland as well. Hopefully that will work.
I would love some questions. We talk in a more plain spoken tone. Yeah.
Okay, I actually wanted to, I'm really interested in the way you're sort of mobilizing what I see like Walter Benjamin's project of redemption, especially in terms of like the German lineage of critique. And so one of the things that you really talked about, the idea of when politics become aestheticized is this sort of natural leading in fascism. But then the obverse of that, the sort of politicization of aesthetics, which I think is like a popular thing that people are attempting to do right now. I'm just interested in how you think about that, because I think there's this sort of weird, actually secretly conservative aspect that's really popular within art now, which is that because of this like strange, I think it's like a period of latency even within practice, that people are clutching to things like craft as like this specific pathway or this weapon that you can take with you into this sort of aestheticization of politics or reversing it. I wonder how you see that in terms of contemporary art, as far as like when, because you did mention something about the idea of where a practice comes from.
Yes.
And the idea that the words that you can speak about it only come at the end of the day, which I agree with. But I think there's also this strand that's taking place right now, which I said before, which is this secretly conservative clutching on to this idea of craft or practice that comes before the revolution or comes before the rupture. And I'm just interested to hear how you sort of see that happening, even in just in LA artists maybe.
It's true. I mean, one thing that I was sort of concerned to develop is this idea that within that whole lineage that you're talking about, and you know, Benjamin comes to it pretty late in a way. There's all this backup of this kind of idea of the and it's not. I mean, he puts it into the terms of Jewish mysticism. A lot of these romantic writers are Catholics and Protestants and whatnot. But the notion that art inherits a symbology from the church, and yes, that symbology has a content that remains somehow within it, and it has to do with redemption, as you're saying. But the question of redemption, I was thinking, flares up in different ways at different times, and that's why I was kind of making a distinction between saving and redeeming, because there's a certain moment when, due to the sort of political context, right, we're not simply talking about individual souls, and we're talking about whole cultures, and I think there's that thinking starts to become really clearly articulated in the writing around art, and perhaps in also some of the production that sort of emerges out of that period. And you know, I was trying to get back to, because I ran out of time, I wanted to show some slides from the last show that I put together, which had a very apocalyptic flavor to it, which I got afraid was secretly conservative. That the apocalyptic tone is in itself a kind of covertly conservative tone. And so part of this came out of a kind of rethinking of how can I explain my stake in this, other than I want to see everything destroyed and built my own fort, in the rubble or something. And it had to do with, this relationship of art to crisis. That at that point we're not just dealing with redemption. We're dealing with a kind of a more immediate response to the situation on the ground, right? So there's a longer term concept of this sort of long evolution of the spirit, from these mythic symbols of the church to the mythic symbols of art. But then there's also these moments of crisis when something else happens that requires an immediate kind of attention. And I guess, I mean, I didn't quite make the connection, but that also feeds into the asterisk and obelisk kind of notion. You know, that these are two ways to kind of respond to mark one's place in a particular moment. Both of them, I think, having this warlike context around them. And that, I guess that's what also is kind of relevant in relationship to the talk, is that, you know, we are in either a war or an interwar period ourselves. So I was rereading these pieces by Freud with that kind of interest, you know, because a lot of the thoughts that he's having about culture are, I think, probably very similar to thoughts everyone's having right now. But about craft specifically, the difference, though, I would say about craft, it generally comes out of a tradition, right? And so there is a concept behind it, a strong concept, and you adhere to the concept, and the concept generates these particular results. And I'm not sure if you're using craft as a more intuitive way.
That's the way I
Okay. Well, I can sort of describe it also in the opposite way, right? That there's an adherence with a way of doing things, and that entails a direct result or clear results. And yes, I mean, certainly there is a conservative side to that, but there's also a conservative side to what you're talking about, which is a kind of total abandonment of any kind of like rigor or, you know, intellectual responsibility in favor of just a kind of purely intuitive, hands-on, kind of sloshing around, you know.
I'm talking about stream of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
This idea of creating art through the stream of consciousness in the moment as a process, the process being this kind of coming to know.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I guess I was kind of thinking about what is it that's worthwhile enough to develop a stream of consciousness around, right? Because it can't just be anything. That then just kind of leads into, you know, kind of irrelevant, fanciful stuff. There's the stream of consciousness has to be set into motion by something that is really perplexing, right? To you, I mean, that you have a stake in. I teach out at UCLA where Mary Kelly has a big role, a big impact. And she always talks about the artist as a witness, as a kind of witness to something. And everyone has witnessed, or everyone can be a witness to a particular event that no one else can share. And they can develop the kind of acuity of their observation in that one line. But what is it that you will be the witness to, right? And again, that can't be conceptualized up front. It has to be probably approached in a more, again, you know, somewhat intuitive way. Because if you conceptualize it up front, it sort of ends quickly, right? So it has to be this kind of really perplexing, really absorbing problem. And these oftentimes do have some kind of relationship to one's, you know, early life, to some traumatic event. And I can talk about micro trauma too, right? Like just a miniature trauma, as well as something as awful as a world war, and seeing one's parents in a gas mask, or having one's, you know, roof cave in, things like that. But it has to be something that you both know and don't know, right? You have to know it enough to start working, but you can't know it so much to stop working.
You spoke about this idea of the housing, creating a space for the statue, but the statue is not God, but the housing itself maintaining that kind of sense of imbued quality. And it seems like nowadays what's on everyone's mind is this sort of global house,
Mm.
and this kind of pending doom, just coming up from a religious standpoint or an artistic standpoint, and that seems to be influencing the way people are thinking about crises, almost as though it's sort of making it happen. Sort of dwelling on it so much it's unfolding without being able to act on it. And I see that art making is trying to address it, but it's very random. There doesn't seem to be a particular trend. To me, it just, people are reacting all over the place in their art making, but it's like everyone's in process, and there doesn't seem to be any particular statement because it's uncertain what that statement will be.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Well, on the one hand, well, you're talking about this kind of odd schism between globalism, which sort of seems to imply the becoming same of everything, and within that kind of framework, this kind of eruption of all kinds of ethnic, national, etc. Ruptures, right? Where there's this kind of breaking away into ever smaller subcategories and subgroups and more intricately kind of defined borders around things. So there's a kind of weird two-sidedness to the condition of the present, right? Where the art is probably a kind of appropriate response to it in a certain way. That there's this, at least a lot of this, the work that that I put together for this show, Desert Shore, which again was another strand, and I'm kind of weaving into this argument, this essay book, and it was an attempt to look at what is common about a lot of this work. And there, some of what you mentioned, the heterogeneous quality of it, that it's made up of a lot of disparate parts, fragmented, disparate parts, but that are somehow kind of cobbled together in some way. This is a sort of an aesthetic that I guess I've been paying attention to a little bit, sort of this ramshackle aesthetic. And for a while, that could be called almost an art fashion of some sort. But I think it's going to be interesting, again, to see what happens to something like that when, when that kind of attention to it as, what happened at last year's Whitney or whatever, when that kind of attention passes. Because I do think there's something about that kind of on-the-ground bricolage kind of making with the bits and pieces of what's sort of left over. I do think that's a kind of a contemporary, there is something contemporary about that aesthetic. We can tie it back to people like Kurt Schwitters and, work like that, who also had this kind of odd, merger of this sort of cathedral ambition with this kind of junk culture thing, right? Yeah, and that work in particular, and I see a lot of works that have that kind of that sort of look. So that seems like a kind of an appropriate response in a way. And I think the response, I guess what I was arguing here too, is the response can't be a concept, right? An idea. As an aesthetic response, it's seeking to somehow translate what the moment feels like in some way, right? Translate it into a feeling or a sensation of some sort.
Of the housing and the sculpture, no one thing's the god or the religion. It's just the way it works together, so that people are moved by the feeling of it, versus the exact image or the statue being the god. It really isn't anything in itself unless it's enshrined. How galleries or outside the gallery is the shrine, or the world's the shrine.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Sounds good.
That was a lot to think about, what you just presented.
Oh, good. Okay.
Trying to think about the whole time I've been trying to think about artworks in terms of the framework being set up between the asterisk and the obelisk.
Yeah.
And I've been thinking about this Manzoni sculpture that I've only heard described by Stephen Prina. I always wondered if he was actually.
Oh, the sculpture of Dumont?
Yes, yeah. I was thinking, is that the ultimate obelisk?
Maybe, yeah, but it's inverted, so it's the kind of opposite of the martial spirit of the obelisk.
Maybe you could describe that to everyone.
It's like a pedestal that's just put on a piece of ground, but the name of it, the pedestal of the world, kind of forces you to, kind of see yourself as being kind of off the world in a certain sense, right? Because, right, turns everything upside down in a sense.
Yeah, so he writes sculpture of the world on the pedestal and turns it upside down in this sort of, this ridiculous gesture of colonizing the entire world is his art. But it seems like the more you think about it, it's not just this sort of obelisk sculpture because it's such an ineffectual a gesture, really. It's much like Kippenberger's Metronet, in which he has this sort of symbolic network of subway stops at stations that he imagined all over the world. But you talked about being interested in sculptures that had these kind of aspects of both, really, or those most successfully functioning ones to you. And I was trying to think of this sort of extreme example of an obelisk, that would only have those characteristics. And it seems like it's sort of an impossible object. It could only exist theoretically.
Well, it's true, but like for instance, I'm just going to zoom through these. These are just a few shots from this show, Desert Shore. This piece that's freestanding is by Chris Mischlig, and his practice consists of.
Yeah, Chris Mischlig is actually a U of O graduate.
Really?
Undergraduate here, yeah.
Yeah. No, I like this work a lot. And he's devised this system, which I think, to me, sort of, could be used as an example of what we're talking about. All right. So, okay. So here's from the. Hang on. Okay, here's like an installation shot. That's an Andrea Zittel kind of what would you call it? Escape vehicle housing unit in the front, and then those pieces in the back are Chris Mischlig's posters. And what he does is, throughout LA, you have these posters that go up on the street that usually advertise events that are just about to happen. So they're a week away at most, and then they have this kind of quick design. They're super garish. The font is like loud. They're meant to be read from the street. They're like a thing of the street within an automotive culture. So they go out of date really quickly since they're time sensitive in that way, and he pulls them down the moment the event is over. So he's very ethical about these things. Pulls them down when it's over and has like thousands of them. And what he starts doing then is like transposing the elements within them. So he'll cut all the letters out of each one. But not just the letters. He'll break the letters into their individual like lines that make them up and cut all these things out. And with everything that's left, he starts reconfiguring a whole new system of posters. So the one on the left is quite easy. You can see that he took out everything but the $500 and then filled in the spaces where those other letters were with another poster that had a yellow background, right? And the one on the right, though, he's definitely like starting to create another language as a result of this kind of transposition. So here I think each one of these I can see as a kind of, this sort of relationship between Asterisk and Obelisk. It is an art that sort of relates to the street, to making a certain claim on the street, and yet in its reformulation, the thing is given a kind of supplementary meaning. That's not entirely a different meaning, but the meaning, the official meaning of it as advertising, is now something else. And you could read them as some kind of like something from a distant culture, perhaps like even an alien culture. I would say, especially in relationship to perhaps this vehicle of Zitel's. A lot of the work in this show had these sorts of sci-fi elements. Aaron Noble, I think, is the person that painted this graphic on Zitel's vehicle, and it's a collage of all the sort of action, what would you call them? The sort of action graphics from action comics. So all the things that signify that you're moving really fast or hitting something really hard, taken out of their context, taken out of the context of the physical character, and used almost as these abstract elements. Here again, taking something that is a kind of monument of some sort, a superhero comic book, right? Not quite an obelisk, but it's related. And I would say here, this is a piece by, sorry, these are going a little slow here, but this is a piece by Mungo Thompson, where I think the obelisk relationship is made really clear. It's a comic book rack. Yeah. So this is a comic book rack, and it's a similar kind of process where he went through his whole comic book collection and cut out every frame, and then cut out every figure out of every frame, and then recombined the frames into this new narrative that has no human beings in it. So it's a narrative of like worlds destroying, coming back together, people lifting off to space, coming back to Earth, or hitting, via another planet, etc. To me, these are, kind of, I think you have to think about it a little metaphorically, that the comic book can be a kind of obelisk, especially when you present it in this way, and yet when something is done to it, when another meaning is sort of appended to it, when the parts are reconfigured in that way, a space is opened for thinking about these things in a different way. What would a comic book of this sort, which is all about human might and power and our destructive capabilities, what would that look like if we were completely taken out of the narrative, for instance? Another, maybe the last version I'll show is this series of photographs by Dave Bailey of the library at Salton Sea in California, which is, what would you call it even? It's a kind of, it is the result of crisis, right? It's a floodplain. A bunch of farmers got together to kind of pool to develop an irrigation system, but they did it on the cheap, and they flooded all their lands, and it became unfarmable, and they all had to leave. And the result is you have this completely kind of destroyed, salty, smelly, rotting place, which is useless to anyone that wants to develop anything. And so it's become the kind of outpost of floating counterculture and social marginalia, basically, who settle in there. Dave Bailey kind of focused on this structure, and again, one could call a library a kind of obelisk. It's it is the archive. An archive is always an obelisk. That obelisk that I showed you, had all these like this Egyptian sort of symbology. So it had this sort of history carved into it. All institutions are obelisk-like in a certain way, as in the way that they shore up power, and they shore up the power of those that occupy that place, essentially, right? The archons, right? The archive holds the papers of the archons, the rulers of the place. Here, of course, no one owns anything. No one has any right to the land or even wants it, for that matter. But a library was developed, and it has this kind of really interesting relationship to some kind of Wild West outpost or something. But what's interesting about it is it's a lending library whereby whoever people come and go, and whoever's reading something and finishing it will leave it in that library and take someone else's book, and and so on and so forth. So it's a library that has no permanent collection. It's constantly in flux. It is an interesting counter model. I don't want to assign too much utopian potential to it because it's also very depressing. But if you think about it in those terms, right, it is a kind of interesting counter model. The asterisk being, again, this point at which something that was grounded, or that is typically grounded, and that signifies this kind of power, is deposed in some way and is rendered now mutable, and a new order can start to take shape around it.
Is this what you mean by the sort of secret potentiality?
Yes, yeah. The books are constantly changing in here, and there's a kind of ethical principle, which I don't think needs to be enforced, because people that are sort of traveling light, don't want to carry a bunch of books around with them. So it's perfectly practical. It's pragmatic. It's not just altruistic. It's pragmatic to drop this off and pick up something that you haven't read. But I think that kind of function, whereby something that we know as an institution which generally serves to kind of shore up a certain kind of power and knowledge and the state of things in a certain sense, is kind of reconfigured through this, this sort of sly reassemblage, opened up in some way. I'm aligning that with the sort of figure of the asterisk, because it's a placeholder too, right? It also holds a place, but it holds the place for something that's coming, not something that's there.
I have questions maybe a little more. I like hearing you depart on these tangents, actually, but this is maybe just a little more kind of practical. You were talking about contemporary artists going against tradition. Mm-hmm. And I always find ways to look at contemporary artists today as just being part of still a sort of modernist progression, or a reaction to it, which in a way is modernist progression. Yep. But by your definition of, I'm just wondering if any of the artists we're looking at, if you kind of think of them as clearly going against tradition outside of modernist reaction to, in a different kind of way.
Well, yeah, that's such a tricky question, because on some level, there's so many levels of that, right? At the furthest level, you would actually stop calling yourself an artist, in a certain sense, right? You would have to kind of define your agenda as something other than the category art. And then, the next step in is you're an artist, but you refuse to sort of operate within a gallery system or an institutional system. And then, you're in the system, but you're kind of subverting it from inside, and then you're, there's so many levels of it. But I always like artists that sort of find a real stake in what they're doing. And sometimes that, that doesn't have to be tied to a kind of, again, a political agenda, right? But they have a real sort of a real stake, and what they're doing in a certain sense has real repercussions, like no matter how small they might be. And if it's gallery art, maybe it's art that is consciously addressing the gallery audience in some way, and conscious of doing certain things within that space that it can only do in that space, right? So I guess that's what I was. And that's what I was sort of trying to define as to what projects, in a certain sense, whether they are traditional because every artist has to kind of reinvent the tradition somewhat. I mean, somewhat, right? You can't just do exactly the same thing. As an artist, you do. I mean, you don't go into become a general practitioner as an artist and simply learn the rules and as a dentist or something, and then do the job right. I mean, you do have to at least put a little wrinkle in it. So there is that like minute thing all the way to the big thing. But I guess I was talking more about just the idea of a stake, of a real stake in what one is doing.
I don't know if you can show us more how you do that. Give an example of, or like who you've shown right here of this show has like to you maybe the most compelling stake or most articulate in the way you're talking about it.
Yeah, I would say it is. David Bailey is definitely one of my favorite artists. This is not representative of his work, but there's an interesting way that he presents these. In most of his work, God, I wish I had other things to show you, but his name is Dave H. Bailey. You can look it up. It really has this other look to it. It's not usually just photographs presented in this way. It's these kind of wide, kind of hobbyist constructions where he's kind of figuring out how things in the world work. Like how this show, when it was its own show, had his attempts to kind of figure out hands-on, I guess that's heuristically, right? Figure out how a floodplain works, how deltas are formed and whatnot in miniature test situations. So this kind of stuff, kind of like almost like home science experiments, were all over the gallery. But it's because he's really, he's really curious in kind of learning by doing, and that's what his whole project is about. So here there is a component to this work, though, despite the fact that it is, in a way, kind of a traditional photograph. It circles all the way around the gallery, or all around the structure. So it gives you this kind of roundabout look, and they are printed on this relatively cheap, like Xeroxed kind of paper, which he then puts in a frame. And there's this kind of long description on the back of them to the prospective buyer that they have the option either to let the image disintegrate or he will replace it. So there's this kind of handing out a kind of problem, which is a fundamental problem, right, of all museum workers and whatnot. Like, what is the real work? Is it the aged work or is it the restored work? What is work about? Is it about history or is it about the artifact in its pristine state or something? So he kind of inscribes that on the back of these things. Then I also kind of think about this guy. These are just an artist I've liked for a long time. He's a little older, John Devola, and this is some of his earliest work, where he lived right by LAX, one of the least desirable places to live. Of course, because planes are always flying over your house. So a lot of houses around there get abandoned or vandalized, and he did this whole series of works of these vandalized houses. And then sort of presented them with the discourse that he presented them with was one of sculpture. That these were recordings of physical forces again against that house form, right? One has like an immediate kind of affective response to a destroyed house. And a lot of his work has sort of focused on this motif from a famous series called Zuma, where he actually documented one single kind of beautiful property overlooking Zuma Ocean, this beautiful picture window, as it underwent this kind of long process of vandalism, which included graffiti, which he actually participated in at one point, sort of. But even here, he's in a way collaborating somewhat with the Vandals. So it brings up those kinds of questions. You know, is art a product of a construction of this kind of dwelling, or is it a product of the destruction of that? Does the destruction of it produce a sense of anxiety, or does it produce a kind of sense of freedom or something, right? Does the destruction of these things sort of open them up, possibly, to thinking about a house, you know, in a completely different way, as an aesthetic proposal, you know, one that's kind of taken out of the frame of morality. I think it has all of those potentials. So again, taking something that, you know, the suburban house that kind of signifies groundedness, normalcy in its most essential form, and then picturing it in this moment where it suddenly becomes extremely vulnerable. You know, you have a certain kind of empathy with the form, but perhaps also kind of a little bit of sadistic pleasure in the way that photography can so well document, like the force of, you know, the force of, I don't have that picture unfortunately, but the force of a door being kicked in. You know, there's a beautiful picture of like a door kind of kicked off the hinges, and you can see the footprint on the door, and every part of what happened in that picture has been recorded, like forensically in the picture. And there is a certain kind of pleasure in that that's sculptural, right? Where you can see all the forces acting on each other. So he's another one that I find interesting in that way. I mean, I ended up thinking about all the works in a slightly different way because, again, my first thought was this show had an apocalyptic theme, and it had this theme, you know, at the same time as I went to some movie where like every single preview was, you know, end of the earth film, like one after another. And I'm thinking, like, what a drag to be putting on this show, you know, at this time, because there is something so conservative about that apocalyptic kind of spirit, right? And since then, I've really been trying to kind of reevaluate or rearticulate what the interest might be in this type of practice or this type of imagery. This practice that is, you know, I can relate it all to bricolage in a way. It works with found elements, with parts of the world, typically the outside world, that have a very definite meaning, that are, you know, generic signs or symbols, and then begins to kind of reconfigurate them in some way or open them up to other possibilities.
Well, I think we need to line things
All right.
up. Well, thank you very much.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone.